Although I'm going to spend my 25 minutes filling in the details, my thesis tonight is fairly simple. During the Gilded Age, most Americans thought of wealth as the cause of poverty, in the sense that the conditions that produced great fortunes were the same conditions that generated large numbers of poor. These conditions, encapsulated in the corporation, distorted an economy whose legitimate purpose was to produce Republican citizens. Basically, all I'm doing is giving you a caption for many of the slides I'm going to show you. There was a great deal of consensus on this basic view across the political spectrum because both conservatives and radicals derived their views from small L liberalism, with its belief in contract freedom, individualism, a minimal state, and laissez-faire. What I mean by liberals is best illustrated by Ron Paul and his followers. They are almost literal descendants of 19th century American liberals. In the 19th century, these liberals packed considerable cultural punch. When the Northern commercial elite went to their Congregationalist, Presbyterian, Unitarian, or Universalist churches, their preachers were liberal. When their children attended universities and took classes, their professors were liberal. When they read the elite journals of the day, such as E.L. Godkin's Nation, they read the writings of liberals. Liberalism provided the central point of reference in thinking about wealth and poverty. The most influential thinkers were all either liberals or lapsed liberals. Liberalism in the United States began as a radical democratic doctrine adopted by Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson and their followers. This is Jackson opposing the bank. This is precisely the kind of attacks on privilege that liberalism was designed to undertake. It aimed at overthrowing privilege, hierarchy, and inherited authority. It ended up as a conservative doctrine aimed at protecting property. How that happened is an interesting story, but it's not the one I'm going to talk about tonight. Instead, I want to begin at the moment, the end of the Civil War, when it seemed that liberal ideas of a society based on contracts between autonomous individuals would reach fruition in the United States, and it would be defined by the absence of extremes of great wealth and poverty. As in so many things, Abraham Lincoln provides both the best articulation of that society and its most coherent symbol. Lincoln told an audience in New Haven, Connecticut in 1860, and the quote's worth considering in detail, "I'm not ashamed to confess that 25 years ago I was a hired laborer, mauling rails, at work on a flatboat, just what might happen to any poor man's son. But in the free states, a man knew that he can better his condition. There is no such thing as a free man being fatally fixed for life in the condition of a hired laborer. The man who labored for another last year, this year labors for himself, and next year he will hire others to labor for him. If a man continues through life in the condition of a hired laborer, it is not the fault of the system, but because of either a dependent nature which prefers it, or improvidence, folly, or singular misfortune. The free labor system opens the way for all, gives hope to all, and energy and progress and the improvement of the condition of all." At the beginning of the Gilded Age, the idea of enough very often trumped the ambition of endless accumulation. Charles Schofield considered himself, quote, opulent enough. That world had vanished by 1900. Instead, the United States was a country that contained extremes. We're now moving back to San Francisco. This is the Crocker Mansion in 1900. Extremes Lincoln had not envisioned outside of the slave system that he had helped end. It contained grinding urban poverty and wealth of the kind that only Cornelius Vanderbilt had amassed by the 1860s. These are the houses of Mark Hopkins and Leland Stanford on Nob Hill before the earthquake. I shouldn't say this, but for all the suffering of the earthquake, it destroyed those houses. It didn't do all bad. These are kinds of things that should have vanished. This was not supposed to happen. Liberalism was supposed to prevent it. Liberalism found itself confined to an intellectual tightrope, tilting at one moment toward denial that it had failed at all, and claiming that the world Lincoln described lived and existed still, and then at another moment tilting the other way, justifying a new, harsher world as one that bestowed rewards on the deserving and punishments on the morally flawed. The tightrope metaphor is not entirely fair, because in fact there was no single homogeneous liberal, but rather numerous people on that tightrope, some leaning one way and some leaning the other. Those arguing that the liberal world of striving individualists, each making their own way in the world and succeeding or failing according to their abilities and efforts, were not the most impressive American thinkers. But they remained a strong presence in American popular culture. Securing equality started men like Henry George, who began from conventional liberal premises down a road that condoned first government regulation and then government ownership in order to restrain the power of corporations and the wealthy. In doing so, they abandoned liberal means but sought liberal ends. The point of an economy for anti-monopolists, and this is simply foreign to us today, was not to maximize wealth or even minimize poverty, although these would be their corollaries. It was to produce Republican citizens who had the education, leisure, and economic independence to participate in the affairs of the nation. The goal, as expressed by George McNeil of the Knights of Labor, was to engraft Republican principles onto our industrial system. As a miner in the Union Pacific coal mines in Rock Springs, Wyoming put it, corporations tried to force men to sign away, quote, their free speech, their liberty, and their manhood. Anti-monopolism thus saw both great wealth and great poverty in the form of contract labor, which they racialized as dangerous and linked. They were thus the opponents of great wealth, but they're also the opponents of those poor workers whom they thought threatened white manhood. In the West, they're xenophobic. In the South, they're deeply racist. The attempts by Andrew Carnegie in his Gospel of Wealth and people like Stanford in founding this university were efforts to counter these attacks. They came largely at the end of the century and were not even particularly convincing to the rich themselves. Some of the most searing accounts of wealth did not even focus on the dangers it presented to the polity, but rather on the kind of men it rewarded. Those making them were well-to-do themselves. This is Charles Francis Adams. Business success, money-getting, comes from a rather low instinct. Certainly as far as my observation goes, it is rarely met with in combination with the finer or more interesting traits of character. I have known, and know tolerably well, a good many successful men, big financially, men famous during the last half-century, and a less interesting crowd I do not care to encounter. Not one that I have ever known would I care to meet again, either in this world or the next, nor is one of them associated in my mind with the idea of humor, thought, or refinement. A set of mere money-getters and traders. They were essentially unattractive and uninteresting. That's the great-grandson of the President of the United States, President of the Union Pacific Railroad. Charles Francis, who wrote this, would have little in common with the late Gore Vidal, except to agree that, quote, the more money an American accumulates, the less interesting he becomes. Adams' cynicism is an outlier, not because it disparages wealth, that's a commonplace, but because it does not see it as a symptom of danger. The rich for Adams are simply embarrassing. The anti-monopolists, with their belief that the conditions that created great wealth were the same as those that yielded mass poverty, and that the wealthy were not just boring, but dangerous, was closer to the heart of the Gilded Age. Thank you.